Hello everyone. Let's start the recording over here. Hello everyone, this is Reverend Dr. Roger Paul, and tonight we're going to study the Greenwich Book paper 79, the Andite expansion in the Orient. We started this last week, but kind of crashed on us, so we're going to try it again tonight from the beginning. Alright. Let's have a little prayer and we'll get started. Dear, would you say a prayer for me?
Dear Heavenly Father, Mother God, we thank you so much for this day. Thank you for this opportunity, us coming together and studying your word. Help us to be alert and aware, and the information that we learn tonight, may we pass it on to others and bless their hearts and their minds and their souls. We thank you for everything, we thank you for each other, and we thank you for this wonderful opportunity once again. It's always in your name, Jesus, this might be never on we pray and give thanks. Amen.
We're on page 878.1 in the original book, or paper 7901 on the new ones. Okay, I'll start reading tonight too, since I have no break. Paper 79, Andite expansion in the Orient. Asia is the homeland of the human race. It was on the southern peninsula of this continent that Andon and Fonto were born, in the highlands of what is now Afghanistan. Their descendant Badabnan founded a primitive center of culture that persisted for over 1/2 million years. Here at this eastern focus of the human race, the Samic peoples differentiated from the Andonic stock, and Asia was their first home, their first hunting ground, their first battlefield. Southwestern Asia witnessed the successive civilizations of Dalmatians, Nodites, Adamites, and Andites, and from these regions the potentials of modern civilization spread to the world. And we have a picture here of the Middle East, okay, and Afghanistan's where that little arrow is, or this right here. And where they're talking about in the highlands is almost right in the southeast or southwestern end of the picture there in Afghanistan. And this is where the human race started. Contrary to what you've been taught in school that it was Africa. It was not Africa, it was Afghanistan. So, just so that you know. Alright. Let's go on. Billy, would you take the next paragraph, please? You out there, Millie?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay.
For over 20 years, 25,000 years on down to nearly 2,000 excuse me. For over 25,000 years on down to nearly 2000 BC, the heart of Eurasia was predominantly, though diminishingly, Andite. In the lowlands of Turkestan, the Andites made the westward turning around the inland lakes into Europe, while from the highlands of this region they infiltrated eastward. Eastern Turkestan, Sinkiang, and to a lesser extent Tibet were the ancient gateways through which these peoples of Mesopotamia penetrated the mountains to the northern lands of the Yellow Men. The Andite infiltration of India proceeded from the Turkestan highlands into the Punjab, and from the Iranian grazing lands through Baluchistan. These earlier migrations were in no sense conquest. They were, rather, the continual drifting of the Andite tribes into western India and China.
And if y'all remember from last week, I may have mentioned this, that Genghis Khan was the last of the Andites. This is what they're talking about, the Andites of Turkestan. And Genghis Khan was the last of them, the Mongolians, which was the last of the Andites. I think it was 500 BC, 500 before Christ. So
Genghis Khan was the last Andite, last of the
last
Andites?
of the Andites, right?
Huh.
You mean the last pure-blooded?
Well, mixture of the Andites. They've been so intermingled after that. There weren't any enough of the Andite blood for anybody to really be considered Andite. But the men of Genghis Khan, his tribes people, the horsemen, what we call the barbarians, were the very last of the Andites. Okay?
Hey, Roger.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the Andanites was descendants of Andon and Fonta with the Adamites.
Yeah, the descendants of Andon and Fonda with the Adamites.
Mixed, yeah, with
Mixed,
the
yeah.
Adamites. Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Right. Okay. All right. Tim, would you take the next one?
For almost 15,000 years, centers of mixed Andite culture persisted.
Andite culture.
Andite culture persisted in the basin of the Tigris River and the Singlanton or Singlan, and to the south in the highland, Turan Valley was the easternmost outpost of the true Andinite culture. Here they built their settlements and entered into trade relations with the progressive Chinese to the east and with the Andinites to the north. In those days, the Taram region was a fertile land. The rainfall was plentiful. To the east, the Gobi was an open grassland where the herders were gradually turning to agriculture. This civilization perished when the rain winds shifted to the southeast. But in its day, it revealed Mesopotamia itself.
It rivaled Mesopotamia.
Mesopotamia.
You're talking about the Gobi Highlands, or Plainslands, right? That's the area where Gobi Tepe is. Göbekli Tepe is, right? So the ruins they're talking about, and the civilization that rivaled Mesopotamia itself was there. Okay, and that was the same area to the west of that, where the Göbekli Tepe is. If you go to the east slightly, that's where Van and Emidan supposedly had the river Van, or the ocean, the water Van, named after Van and Emidan, right? So they were in that area. I'm not sure about the
Not, at the present time, that's a very arid wasteland.
area, yeah, it's an arid wasteland, and they mention that in the book, Rodney, that because the rains dried up, that whole fertile area disappeared, so they had to move, and that's when they moved down into Mesopotamia. Okay, it's kind of interesting how all of this works out. You can follow this on maps very easily. It's kind of interesting. Rodney, would you take the next one, please?
Surely. By 8000 BC, the slowly increasing aridity of the highland regions of Central Asia began to drive the Andites through the river bottoms and the sea shores. This increasing drought not only drove them to the valleys of the Nile, Euphrates, Indus, and Yellow rivers, but produced a new development in Andite civilization. A new class of men, the traders, began to appear in large numbers.
Notice how they migrating to the water, because they're agriculturalists, they're farmers, right? So they have to go where the water is. When the water dries up, they got to move, right? And that's what caused a lot of migration back in those days, right? Here.
When climatic conditions made hunting unprofitable for the migrating Andites, they did not follow the evolutionary course of the older races by becoming herders. Commerce and urban life made their appearance. From Egypt through Mesopotamia and Turkestan to the rivers of China and India, and the more highly civilized tribes began to assemble in cities devoted to manufacture and trade. Andania became the Central Asian commercial metropolis, being located near the present city of Ashgabat. Commerce in stone, metal, wood, and pottery was accelerated on both land and water.
Notice how industry and trade drove people along pathways too, and that helped the migration also.
Now, I've got a note here on, that was 25,000 years ago.
Yeah, that was 25,000.
And I probably put that note there because of the mention of metal.
The mention of what?
Metal? You know, I mean, surely they had stone and wood and pottery, but metal 25,000 years ago?
Yeah, that's right, Rodney. Metal 25,000 years ago. And where did that come from? That come from the teachings originally from the Dalmatians, and then later on by Adam and Eve and their descendants. But according to your history books, we didn't start working in metal till 8,000 years ago, which is wrong. Okay? We got a lot of stuff in our history books that are just error because they didn't know any better. All right?
Of course.
And so, yeah, it was 25,000 years ago, and that was from the descendants of Adam and Eve and the descendants of the Dalmatians, right? All right. Well, yeah. When climatic conditions made hunting unprofitable for the migrating Andites, they did not follow the... Did we just
I
read,
just read that.
we just read that? Sorry, here. I was trying to find my way here because I'm looking slow. Okay. But ever-increasing drought gradually brought about the great Andite exodus from the lands south and east of the Caspian Sea. The tide of migration began to veer from northward to southward, and the Babylonian cavalrymen began to push into Mesopotamia. All right. Notice the guys with horses are always the ones attacking, right?
A horseman.
Horsemen, that's right. Millie, would you take the next one, please?
Increasing aridity in Central Asia further operated to reduce population and to render these people less warlike. And when the diminishing rainfall to the north forced the nomadic Andanites southward, there was a tremendous exodus of Andites from Turkestan. This is the terminal movement of the so-called Aryans into the Levant and India. It culminated that long dispersal of the mixed descendants of Adam, during which every Asiatic and most of the island peoples of the Pacific were to some extent improved by these superior races.
So this movement caused an improvement of the races because the best went with them, right? The descendants of Adam and Eve and their children. All right. Kim, would you take the next one, please?
Thus, while they were dispersed over the eastern hemisphere, as the Andanites were disposed.
Andites.
Andites.
You really like those two terms.
You like the Andites,
Yeah. Andanites. I can't even say it. Were disposed of their homelands in Mesopotamia and Turkestan, for it was this extensive southward movement of Andanites that diluted the Andites in Central Asia, nearly to the vanishing point.
Okay. And it's important to know which is which. The Andanites are what? The descendants of Andon and Fanka, right? And the Sangric races. And the Andites were descendants of the Nadites and the descendants of Adam and Eve, right? Big difference between the two. Okay. Because the Andites would have the violet blood, the Andanites would not. You follow?
Roger, one more time. The
Andites
were
the descendants of the Nadites and Adam and Eve, the children of Adam and Eve. Okay? The Andanites were the descendants of Andon and Fonda and the Sangric races.
Right, the six colored races.
Six colored races, that's right.
Okay. And that's spelled Andonites.
Let's flip it here. Rodney, would you take the next one, please?
One more time, what were the Andites? They were from who?
The Andites were the descendants of Adam and Eve and the Nadites.
Adam's son and
Adam's son and Rada,
Rada.
right? That was the Andites, right? They were called
Adam and Eve and
they were
the
called
Nodites.
Adamsonites when they're the direct descendants of Adam. They were called Andites when they're the descendants of the son of Adam and the Nodites. You with me?
So the Andite, Andite, is separate than the An, what I just got done saying.
Andonites are separate.
Okay.
The Andonites are the descendant of Andon, and Fanta,
The
right?
six colored
And the
races.
6 color races. Right. You with me, everybody?
Yeah,
Okay.
I'm with you.
So that would mean what? That means the Andites had a mixture still of the violet blood, right?
Exactly.
Okay? And they had totally intermingled by the time of the heir of Genghis Khan. Okay? So by then, their blood was so dispersed you could not truly call them Andites any longer because they were so intermingled. They were a mixed race. Okay? That makes sense?
So the Andite came after the Andonites.
That's correct.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
Long.
Yeah, the Andites came much further after the Andonites. The Andonites were around 250,000 years before the Andites. Got me? Because the 6 colored races and the descendants of Andon and Fanta were very early, right? Okay. Actually, it was 450,000 years early.
Actually, our first human beings, were Andon and Fanta, so that makes
That's
sense.
right, yeah. That cleared up a little bit?
Yeah, it did. Thank you.
Okay. All right. I think you're up next.
I think I am.
That's what I'm saying, yeah. Rodney?
But even in the 20th century after Christ, there are traces of Andite blood among the Iranian and Tibetan peoples, as is witnessed by the blonde types occasionally found in these regions. The early Chinese, how do you pronounce that word?
Annals.
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 Annals record the presence of the red-haired nomads to the north of the peaceful settlements of the Yellow River. And there still remain paintings which faithfully record the presence of both the blonde Andite and the brunette Mongolian types in the Tarim basin of long ago.
Okay, let's think about this.
Roger,
Yeah,
so it seems to me what it's saying is Adam and Eve must have been blonde-haired.
blonde-haired and blue-eyed. That's correct.
Yeah.
Blonde-haired and blue-eyed. That was part of the violet blood. Where did the Aryan, the so-called, what they call the so-called Aryan race come from? The blonde-haired, blue eyes, right? That came from whom? Adam and Eve. All right? So the Aryan race, the so-called Aryan race, which there really never was an Aryan race, is the descendants of Adam and Eve. Okay? And the Mongolian red hairs, okay, are also descendants of the violet blood. So the Mongolians, of which Genghis Khan was a group of, right, the Mongolians who conquered the world, they were the last of the pure blood Andite. They weren't really pure blood, but they had a higher percentage of blood of the Andite blood, right? They were the last generation of the high percentage of violet blood, okay, or Andite blood. That's what they're talking about. So the red-haired Mongols and the yellow-haired or blonde descendants were from the violet race. You follow me?
But our Matera son and daughter also had a violent hue, right?
Violent, they had a
sunlight?
violent hue because they were encircuited. When they were no longer encircuited, when they defaulted and were no longer taking the sustenance of the Garden of Eden, they lost the violet hue.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, the violet hue was part of being encircuited. You follow me? So what does that mean? That means Van and Amadon probably had the same violet hue because they were encircuited and were eating from the tree of life. Okay, that's one of the reasons they considered Van and Amadon like gods. Okay, and probably many of the older pictures and drawings and paintings showed halos around what were supposedly holy people, is because of the hue. Alright? Everything's got a reason.
The last great manifestation of the submerged military genius of the Central Asiatic Andites was in AD 1200, when the Mongols under Genghis Khan began the conquest of the greater portion of the Asiatic continent. And like the Andites of old, these warriors proclaimed the existence of one God in heaven. The early breakup of their empire long delayed cultural intercourse between Occident and Orient, and greatly handicapped the growth of the monotheistic concept in Asia.
I misquoted the date earlier. Here it is, AD 1200. So it was 1200 AD, after death of Christ. So not 500 BC. Okay, which I told you a few minutes ago, which is wrong. See, I'm wrong occasionally. I know my wife.
Keeps your
That's right. Okay, so.
But you're still perfect in every way.
Oh yeah.
I got one part of me that is perfect. It's my thought adjuster. The rest of me is all greatly flawed. Okay. So it was the Mongols under Genghis Khan were the last of the Andites. Okay, and that was 1200 AD. So that's a long time after Christ, really. 1200 AD. Right, but they were if their society would have gone on, we would have all been under a monotheistic concept throughout the whole world. You know, but because they broke up over time and he was killed, so that's why it stopped. Okay. Okay. The Andite conquest of India. India is the only locality where all the Urantia races were blended. The Andite invasion, adding the last stock. In the highlands northwest of India, the Sangit races came into existence. And without exceptions, members of each penetrated the subcontinent of India in the early days, leaving behind them the most heterogeneous race mixture ever to exist on the Urantia. Ancient India acted as a catch basin for the migrating races. The base of the peninsula was formerly somewhat narrower than now, much of the deltas of the Ganges and Indies being the work of the last 50,000 years. So if you want to see what the human race will look like when all races are intermixed, look at the Indian people. Because that's what it's going to look like all over the world. Did you catch that? That is where all the Urantia races were blended. So if you take a good picture of Indian people, that's what the whole world will eventually look like in the next 100,000 years.
I thought they were going to be olive skinned.
They are olive skinned.
I think of the India people from India as darker skinned.
Yeah, some of them are. Some of them are very dark skinned, but that depends on whether they mix with the indigo races, the black races of the south, or the northern races, which were the more lighter races. But they become a more homogeneous race. So if you think when all the black races and all the white races and all the yellow races and the red races and all that intermix and start to intermarriage, that's the color skin you're going to end up with, is the same color skin of the Indian people.
So you're talking about India like the Taj Mahal, not like the Red Man?
That's exactly right. No, not Indian like in American Indian, but India, the country.
Okay, thanks.
And there are more geniuses in India than any other place in the world.
Yeah.
Well, a lot of doctors. You know.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
because of the bloodline.
Mhm.
Very intelligent people, right? You also find more vegetarians in India than any other place in the world. Because many of the Indian people, as they migrated from Mesopotamia, followed the ways of Adam and Eve, which was vegetarian. Amazing what you learn from this book.
Mhm.
Okay.
It gives you a greater respect for the, for all the different nationalities.
It does.
It
It
does.
really does. Okay, Billy, would you like to?
The earliest race mixtures in India were a blending of the migrating red and yellow races with the aboriginal Andinites. This group was later weakened by absorbing the greater portion of the extinct eastern green peoples, as well as large numbers of the orange race, was slightly improved through the limited admixture with the blue men, but suffered exceedingly through assimilation of large numbers of the indigo race. But the so-called Aborigines of India are hardly representative of these early people. They are rather the most inferior southern and eastern fringe, which was never fully absorbed by either the early Andites or their later appearing Aryan cousins.
There you go. A mixture of the races. Okay. Tim, would you take the next one?
By 20,000 BC, the population of Western India had already become tinged with the Adamic blood, and never in the history of Urantia did any one people combine so many different races. But it was unfortunate that the secondary Sangic strains predominated, and it was a real calamity that both the blue and the red man were so largely missing from this race melting pot of long ago. More of the primary Sangic strains would have contributed very much toward the enhancement of what might have been an even greater civilization. As it developed, the red man was destroying himself in the Americas. The blue man was disporting himself in Europe and the early descendants of Adam. And the most of the later ones exhibited little desire to admix with the darker colored peoples, whether in India, Africa, or elsewhere.
So even though the plan was for Adam's sons and daughters to mix with all the races when they got to be 1 million, even they did not look forward to mixing with some of the races. Right?
Roger says, what's the definition of disporting? Just not going anywhere?
But
blue
yeah,
man was
basically
disporting?
he was happy where he was, so he didn't want to move.
Yeah, okay.
So
Yeah.
I
That's
feel
right.
about life.
Yeah. Yeah, staying put, right?
And I wonder how the red man was destroying himself.
The red men destroyed themselves more than the white men did, actually, Rodney, because before the white men discovered the red men in America, there were basically, I believe, 12 major, there was hundreds of sub-tribes, but there are 12 major Indian tribes, and they constantly warred against each other.
Oh,
with-
yeah, okay, I understand.
Yeah, and they almost destroyed themselves and the whole nation, just like the Aztecs destroyed themselves by human sacrifice. But that, with the exception of the case, is Anamanawantan in California. They were descendants of the Blackfeet Indian, and they were very peaceful. They did not cause war against other tribes. And it was Anamanawantan's teachings that almost changed the face of America, because for a short period of time there was peace all over the country in America, because he brought all 12 tribes together and got them to stop fighting for a while. then of course when he died, they went back to warring each other, and the Indians themselves actually destroyed more of their kind than the white men did. The white men just finished the job, you know. Really, it was the Indians that battling against each other that destroyed most of them. And just like the Aztecs literally destroyed their own race by human sacrifice. You know, they kept sacrificing people to please these gods that didn't exist, and the priests were in control of the population. And that's why in South America there's all these abandoned civilizations that just seem to die out because they destroyed themselves, basically. And if you listen to the TV shows, it's a big mystery what happened. Right? They think they died off of disease, but they didn't. Okay. Who's up? I think. Millie, did you just read?
No, I just read.
Okay. Rodney.
My turn.
Yeah.
About 15,000 BC, increasing population pressure throughout Turkestan and Iran occasioned the first really extensive Andite movement toward India. For over 15 centuries, these superior peoples poured in through the highlands of Balochistan, spreading out over the valleys of the Indus and Ganges, and slowly moving southward into Deccan. This Andite pressure from the northwest drove many of the southern and eastern inferiors into Burma and southern China, but not sufficiently to save the invaders from racial obliviation. Wow.
They don't mince words, did they? You know, they say that inferior people were normally just wiped out over time, but in this case, they did not sufficiently get rid of the bad ones. You know? So, as far as they're concerned,
The failure of India to achieve the hegemony of Eurasia was largely a matter of topography. Population pressure from the north only crowded the majority of the people southward into the decreasing territory of the Deccan, surrounded on all sides by the sea. Had there been adjacent lands for immigration, then would the inferiors have been crowded out in all directions, and the superior stocks would have achieved a higher civilization.
so don't mince words. They mean, you know, you need to mix with people or beings that are at least as good, if not better than yourself. Right. As it was, their earlier Andite conquerors made a desperate attempt to preserve their identity and stem the tide of racial engulfment by the establishment of rigid restrictions regarding intermarriage. Nonetheless, the Andites had become submerged by 10,000 BC, but the whole mass of the people had been markedly improved by this absorption. What they're talking about is the descendants of Adam and Eve, his son and Rada, had all been absorbed or submerged into the population by about 10,000 BC, right? But the last of the Andites, remember, wasn't until about, when? 1200 AD. Right, so their descendants were still around. Millie?
Turn the speaker on. Race mixture is always advantageous in that it favors versatility of culture and makes for a progressive civilization. But if the inferior elements of social racial stocks predominate, such achievements will be short-lived. A polyglot culture can be preserved only if the superior stocks reproduce themselves in a safe margin over the inferior. Unrestrained multiplication of inferiors with decreasing reproduction of superiors is unfailingly suicidal of cultural civilization.
Of course.
And I think that's what we're dealing with now too. Yeah,
Is that-
because the more highly educated people are having fewer children.
They are, which is backwards of what it should be.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's kind of interesting, I want to mention this too. That's not the case in all societies, though.
No.
Look at the Mormons. Okay,
Yeah.
very educated, very smart.
Yeah.
You know, they prepare for disasters, everything.
Mhm.
Everything you'd want in
And
society.
then you have large families.
And they have large families, so it's not that way all over the
No, I
world.
just meant predominantly.
Yeah, but it is. That's the predominant
Yeah.
trend right now. And undesirables in our country, I don't know about other countries as well, but in our country, we reproduce undesirables before we can handle it, more than we can handle right now. And you see that in the breakdown of the cities and things like that. So it's a hard problem. But how do you get people to stop having children that shouldn't be having children, you know, without sterilizing it? And then you're taking away basic rights, you know. So it's, you know, who has answers for these things? That's what Adam and Eve was supposed to teach us how to do, you know. Okay.
And the Mormons also go to church for 3 hours.
That's
Yeah.
what they do. Their whole process of their missions and things like that is very good. Very, very good.
But who are we to judge, you know, who the intelligent and the non-intelligent is? Is it criminals? Is it a bad mixture? Like the Bhagavad Gita says, you know, don't mix with bad strains, you know, like criminals and outcasts.
Well,
That's how the Brahmin priest, you know, and the Vedas got started with.
yeah, well,
all this.
we're not really qualified to judge. That's part of the problem, Tim, and that's what Adam and Eve was supposed to be here for, to help us know how to judge what was good. But common sense should tell us a lot. You know, if you see, if your children starts mixing with bad elements, starts going after drugs and alcohol and things like that, instead of pursuing more productive things like an education and family and church and things like that, then, you know, it's kind of a red light, you know, saying there's something wrong here, and it's all in how we bring up our children. It really is. You bring up a child in a godless family, a godless situation, and never teach them the proper way. How are they supposed to, at some magic age of decision, be able to make a decision on what's good and what's bad? They can't. They don't have any pointers to go in the right direction.
Right, because there's a lot of atheists like that too that,
Yeah.
you know, determine what's,
Yeah.
there is no good, there is no bad.
Yeah, exactly.
So stupid.
Yeah. So it's really up to us to teach our children and teach our grandchildren the proper things, regardless of what. And there's families that just will not teach their children religious thought and religious concepts because they think it's overbearing on them, and you're sending them a certain direction. And there is something true about you raise a child in a certain way, and they'll always come back to it. You know, if you raise a child aware of God, they'll always come back to the concept of God.
Yeah, it's incredible you mentioned that because recently in a sermon I was listening to, there's two families, and basically one was a criminal and the other one went to church, and the one who went to church, you know, did much more greater than the one who ended up in jail, and, you know, and turned out he was Charles Manson. So
Yeah.
yeah, in the sermon, you know, what the pastor was speaking, I thought, wow, you know, that makes sense. You know, you go to church, it does, you know, do some good, and versus, you know, the other route where the mom and parents are locked up, etc. You know.
Yeah. Let's go on. Who's up here? You just read.
Thank goodness.
No, did Diane read?
Yeah, I just read.
Did you just read? It's my turn now. Had the Andite conquerors been in numbers 3 times what they were, or had they driven out or destroyed the least desirable third of the mixed orange, green, indigo inhabitants, then would India have become one of the world's leading centers of cultural civilization, and undoubtedly would have attracted more of the later waves of Mesopotamians that flowed into Turkestan and thence northward to Europe. So India had a chance to become the center of the world at one time. Okay, Millie, the Dravidian India. Did you take that?
Yes. Dravidian India. The blending of the Andite conquerors of India with the native stock eventually resulted in that mixed people which has been called Dravidian. The earlier and purer Dravidians possessed a great capacity for cultural achievement, which was continuously weakened as their Andite inheritance became progressively attenuated. Attenuated.
That's right.
And this is what doomed the budding civilization of India almost 12,000 years ago. But the infusion of even a small amount of the blood of Adam produced a marked acceleration in social development. This composite stock immediately produced the most versatile civilization then on Earth.
It always comes back to Adam's blood. All right. Tim.
Not long after conquering India, the Dravidian Andites lost their racial and cultural contact with Mesopotamia, but the later opening up of the sea lanes and the caravan routes reestablished these connections, and at no time within the last 10,000 years has India ever been entirely out of touch with Mesopotamia on the west and China to the east. Although the mountain barriers greatly favored western intercourse.
It's harder to go over mountains than it was to go to China, right? All right. Rodney,
I've got a question, I guess, or a comment.
go ahead.
We have types of blood, A minus, B plus,
Mm-hmm.
O negative, O positive.
Right.
Does that have anything to do with the violet blood?
Yes and no, Rodney. That's a two-sided question because yes, it would indicate how much of certain types of blood that we were mixed with. But we've been so deluged over time, and everything's watered down to the point where it's hard to make any specific type justifications to say, the O positive has more violet blood than the B negative or vice versa. So, plus and the fact we don't really know which one of the blood types that Adam and Eve had, right? We do know we can analyze the DNA, but we can't get down to the blood type of those specific individuals. We can only get down to the blood type of the most common in certain areas, and the others that cropped up over time. So you can't really say, if you have B negative blood that you were a descendant of Adam and Eve, or if you have O positive blood that you're a descendant of that. It just doesn't work that way. So.
But surely they had a different blood type.
Oh, I'm sure they did. Well, it was yes and no on that too, Rodney, because they started out, they encirculated, but they also had the DNA of the local inhabitants. That's how they made their bodies. They took the
Exactly.
DNA from the local inhabitants. So
Whatever inhabitant they found.
that's right. It was a mixture of the people that were there and the new on top of it. So and that's why it ended up.
Yeah, it was just a question that I just thought of.
Yeah, if you had somebody that was an expert on blood types and that sort of thing, I don't know if they could trace that back or not, because we don't know exactly where it started from. We do know at 37 to 39,000 years ago, we had a major DNA change in all of the world. And that is definitely coming from Adam and Eve.
Hey, Roger,
Yeah.
have you heard of the website called UB and the News?
Yeah.
You read
yeah.
your book in the news. That is some wonderful information.
Yeah.
Everybody out there listening needs to check that out. It's got some really good research.
They have some
Scientific.
great stuff on Gobekli Tepe too on that website.
Yeah, his name is Hal something.
Yeah.
Really good.
We saw a show on blood types, and it was located someplace in one of the Norwegian countries,
Yeah.
where they had a certain kind of blood type.
A
and
higher
that's-
percentage of a certain type of blood type.
Right. very concentrated. I can't remember exactly.
But we don't know if that's good or bad, or if that was the
Yeah.
Andite blood,
Yeah.
or we don't know. You know. Okay.
Okay, I think it's my turn.
Your turn.
The superior culture and religious leanings of the peoples of India date from the early times of Dravidian domination and are due, in part, to the fact that so many of the Sethite
Sethite.
priesthood entered India, both in the earlier Andite and the later Aryan invasion. The thread of monotheism
Monotheism.
running through the religious history of India thus stems from the teachings of the Adamites in the Second Orient.
Now, what other religion was very dominant in India?
The Aryans?
No,
Yeah.
Buddhist.
Buddhist, yes.
Yeah, Buddhist.
And the Sethites were who?
The Sethites were the Sethite priesthood started with the son of Adam and Eve, one of the sons of Adam.
Seth?
And Eve. Seth, yeah. But the Sethite priesthood they're talking about here is the descendants and the downgrading of the Sethite priesthood that later on became dominated by the Dravidians. Okay, and the Sethite priesthood entered India, and of course these Sethite priests were mating with all the women. You know, that's the big difference. And so that's what they're talking about here. And later on they had the Aryan invasion, and if it wasn't for the Buddhist stronghold in India, India would have probably been monotheistic, in other words, under one God, pretty quickly. But Buddhism really took hold in India very strongly. Okay, so that's why there's a great number of Buddhists in India.
As early as 16,000 BC, a company of 100 Sethite priests entered India and very nearly achieved a religious conquest of the western half of that polyglot people. But their religion did not persist. Within 5,000 years, their doctrines of the Paradise Trinity had degenerated into the triune symbol of the fire god.
Yeah, so that's what we're talking about. We started out teaching the Trinity, and they ended up with a fire god. You know, that's
Fire god.
That would be Agni.
Would it?
that would be quite a ways away from the concept of the Trinity.
What is that, Tim? Agni?
Agni is the fire god.
Mm-hmm.
Fire
I
god.
put that parentheses here.
And now they call it acne. Arr.
Yeah.
Fire
There
with
you go.
spots on your butt
The
anyway.
temple god. He was the temple god.
Hey, have to
Oh,
go
jeez.
too.
As we descend.
That'd be the
Or
symbol.
electrocute him.
Tim, how do you spell Agni?
Let me get my
I mean, is it N-Y or?
No, I think it's A-G-A-N-G. Hold on. I'll help you out.
Oh, Agony?
Agni.
Acne.
Oh, let's see here. I'll get that, Rodney. I'll get that for you.
No problem.
All right, let's keep going. Who's up here? Me? But for the, did they change it? Yeah. But for more than 7,000 years, down to the end of the Andite migrations, the religious status of the inhabitants of India was far above that of the world at large. During these times, India bid fair to produce the leading cultural, religious, philosophic, and commercial civilization of the world. And but for the complete submergence of the Andites by the peoples of the south, this destiny would probably have been realized.
Hey, Rodney.
Yes.
It's A-G-N-I, fire god of the Hindus. Research complete.
No.
Thank you.
I'm glad I asked.
Millie, would you take the next one, please?
Yes. The Dravidian centers of culture were located in the river valleys, principally of the Indus and Ganges. and in the Deccan, along these three great rivers flowing through the eastern Ghats to the sea. The settlements along the seacoast of the western Ghats owed their prominence to maritime relationships with Samaria.
We know the Samaritans.
I'm not familiar with the word Ghats, Ghats.
Notice the word too, Indus. That's where the Hindus were actually labeled, I believe, by the Mohammedans. They were people across the river. So it started with the Indus Valley. So these days, a lot of Indians too will be offended if you say Hinduism, which is something much later than what they call the Vedas, which just means knowledge.
Yeah.
So there's two different kind of branches. Hinduism is more of an update versus your past, which is called your Vedas, which just translates as knowledge.
Millie, the Ghats is a location, okay, and exactly where it's at, I can't tell you off the top of my head.
Okay.
But,
You go to Google Maps.
yeah, it's on. Well, I doubt that it's still called the Ghats to the sea, Western Ghats. It could be. I'm not sure. It's not something I've looked at myself. So.
And they also refer to the river, the Ganges, as Mother Ganga.
Okay.
Mother.
Tim, would you take the next one, please?
The Dravidians were among the earliest peoples to build cities and engage in extensive export and import businesses, both by land and sea. By 7th BC, camel trains were making regular trips to distant Mesopotamian Dravidian. Shipping was pushing coastwise across the Arabian Sea to the Sumerian cities of the Persian Gulf, and was venturing on the waters of the Bay of Bengal as far as the East Indies. An alphabet together with the art of writing was imported from the Sumerian by these seafarers and merchants.
We just saw a program last night where they talked about these camel trains going across the deserts and things like this. And all along these trails they're talking about here, they built little cities of culture along these things, and they were fortressed, basically. So all along these trails where these camel trains would go across, they'd have resting spots where they'd stop, spend the night, spend their money, bring their goods, and trade and thing on, and then they'd keep going to the next one, on to the next one. And the ruins of these are still there today, all across the deserts and all across the lands. So, and they had a program last night, they were talking about this, where along this trail there were these huge squares about a mile each, and they looked like potholes, and each one of these was buried a human being, okay? And how many they said they're estimated there were? 120,000, something like that. Just the enormous amount of people, and I guess it's either people that were conquered as the horsemen went through, or something to do with these trails that went through the deserts and that sort of thing. It's kind of interesting, but it's kind of funny how these things they talk about in the book are being proved in these programs, digging things up and that stuff almost daily. So it's kind of interesting. And that site you were talking about earlier, Tim. He's documented many of these things on his website. So.
What is that?
The site.
Oh, Halbert, you be in the news?
Harvard's site, yeah. Mm-hmm. He's got quite a bit. All the scientific research and stuff that they're doing, he puts a lot of that stuff on his site.
It's amazing, and it makes you think.
Yeah.
I just read.
Rodney, I think you're right. Yeah.
These commercial relationships greatly contributed to the further diversification of a cosmopolitan culture, resulting in the early appearance of many of the refinements and even luxuries of urban life. When the later appearing aliens entered India, they did not recognize in the Dravidians their Andite cousins submerged in the Samic races, but they did find a well-advanced civilization. Despite biologic limitations, the Dravidians founded a superior civilization. It was well diffused throughout all India and has survived on down to modern times in the Deccan.
How about
Hey, Roger,
that? Yes.
just to let you know, there's 8 sections, so did you want to stop at section 5?
Yeah, we'll go through section 4. We'll stop at section 5. We'll take that up next week. Okay? All right.
Okay.
Let's keep going, dear.
For the Aryan invasion of India. The second Andite penetration of India was the Aryan invasion during a period of almost 500 years in the middle of the 3rd millennium before Christ. This migration marked the terminal exodus of the Andites from their homelands in Turkestan.
Okay. So that traces the Andites. This is where I got the 500 years from. That traces the Andites all the way back to 500 years before Christ. Right. The early Aryan centers were scattered over the northern half of India, notably in the northwest. These invaders never completed the conquest of the country and subsequently met their undoing at this neglect, since their lesser numbers made them vulnerable to absorption by the Dravidians of the south, who subsequently overran the entire peninsula except the Himalayan provinces. And how does this happen? They start marrying with the women, right? They move in, they start marrying with the women, and they start settling down, so they lose that urge to keep conquering, you know. So.
Yeah.
The Aryans made very little racial impression on India except in the northern provinces. In the Deccan, their influence was cultural and religious more than racial. The greater persistence of the so-called Aryan blood in northern India is not only due to their presence in these regions in greater numbers, but also because they were reinforced by later conquerors, traders, and missionaries. Right on down to the 1st century before Christ, there was a continuous infiltration of Aryan blood into the Punjab, the last influence being attended upon the campaigns of the Hellenistic people.
Hey, Roger,
Yeah,
when they say the Hellenistic people, that goes back to Alexander the Great, and is it the Greeks?
yeah, the Greeks and the Romans, mostly Greeks, but yeah, and the Romans also, right?
Okay, thanks.
They're
Okay.
descendants of those. All right. Millie, I think you're up next.
On the Gangetic plain, Aryan and Dravidian eventually mingled to produce a high culture, and this center was later reinforced by contributions from the northeast coming from China.
That's where Genghis Khan came from, right? All right, Tim.
In India, many types of social organizations flourished from the time to time, from the
Semi-democratic system.
semi-democratic systems of the Aryans to despotic
Yeah,
despotic?
Yeah.
and monarchical form of government. The most characteristic feature of society was the persistence of the great social caste that were instituted by the Aryans in an effort to perpetuate racial identity. This elaborate caste system has been preserved on down to the present time.
This is where you came up with blue bloods or true bloods, pure bloods, that sort of thing.
Oh,
But when they say the word Aryans, Roger, they're also referring to like the Indian people, correct?
No, it's mostly the descendants that came before that, the blondes and the redheads and that sort of thing.
Okay, right. I'm thinking of the
Yeah,
Indian
remember
people.
Hitler tried to start his own Aryan race. They're blonde-haired, blue-eyed. In order for his officers to mate, they had to find a blonde-haired, blue-eyed woman. So,
Because I know the Brahmin priests, I believe, were like the Aryan something.
Yeah.
They use that word also, and it's just kind of confusing sometimes.
Yeah, it is. That's why they call it the so-called Aryan race. There really was never a pure Aryan race. It was just the
Okay.
descendants of Right? And when they're talking about these pure blood systems, that's where the idea of blue bloods and kings and queens and stuff like that. That's why the kings and queens tried to intermarry with their brothers and sisters and cousins, start to keep the blood pure in what they call royal blood, and that's where all this started.
So when they talk about Aryan and Dravidian, they're basically talking about who blonde races. We're not talking about the
Most-
Indian people no more.
No, we're talking about the Indian people too, because they mixed with the Indian people.
That's
But they
correct.
were talking about the blonde-haired, blue-eyed races that were the descendants of Adam and Eve and that sort of
Right.
thing.
Okay.
Yeah. Right. And that's what brought up all this blue-blood caste system and that sort of thing. We'll get into that next. Yeah. Who's up to
I think it's
read?
my
Rodney, I
turn.
think you're right.
Of the four great castes, all but the first were established in the futile effort to prevent racial amalgamation of the Aryan conquerors with their inferior subjects. But the premier caste, the teacher priests, stems from the Setites, the Brahmins of the 20th century after Christ, are the lineal, cultural descendants of the priests of the second garden, albeit their teachings differ greatly from those of their illustrious predecessors.
So as they went down through time, they watered down the religion and philosophy and theology and that sort of thing over time.
When the Aryans entered India, they brought with them their concept of deity as they had been preserved in the lingering traditions of the religion of the second garden. But the Brahmin priests were never able to withstand the pagan momentum built up by the sudden contact with the inferior religions of the time after the racial obliteration of the Aryans. Thus, the vast majority of the population fell into the bondage of the enslaving superstitions of inferior religions. And so it was that India failed to produce the high civilization which had been foreshadowed in earlier times.
An interesting note here is we're talking about the pagans, the Brahmin being influenced by the pagans. This happened even after Christ because the Christmas tree basically that we use at Christmas time is a pagan tradition. The Christmas tree came from a pagan religion, and the only way they could get the pagans, the early Christians, to stop celebrating this tree day of the pagan tradition is to make it a quote Christmas tree. So they couldn't get them to stop, so they just incorporated Christmas in with the tree. Isn't that interesting? So when you look at your Christmas tree, if you think it's supposed to be a symbol of Christ, it didn't start out that way. It was started out as the tree day for the pagans. So
It has a really big and interesting history. The fir tree,
it does.
do the research, it's unbelievable. There was a Hebrew guy who was really upset at these Christians because, God, what was it? He was, anyways, the sect that he was with, it's like against Christianity and some of the pagan traditions that they brought in, like
Yeah.
Easter, Astara, and then you have Christmas, basically all our holidays, like, Halloween, Samhain.
Yeah.
But he didn't want to celebrate those kind of traditions like Muslims because it has pagan origins.
Right. It's hard to get people to stop doing something they're used to doing. You try to take away their traditions, and then they get really violent about it. Okay. You're thinking, am I right? The spiritual awakening of the 6th century before Christ did not persist in India, having died out even before the Mohammedan invasion. But someday a great Gautama may arise to lead all India in the search for the living God. And then the world will observe the fruition of the cultural potentialities of the versatile people so long comatose under the benumbing influence of the unprogressing spiritual vision.
Has that happened, Roger?
Not yet. It's beginning to happen in India because a lot of India is converting to Christianity. And that's part of this big battle between Islam and Christianity in India. You know, basically, is the spiritual battle to go over, you know, the Islam wanting to control all of India and Christianity wanting to take over all of India. So it's kind of, and then in the background you still have the Buddhists, right, which has a huge influence in India. So, you know.
Oh, Roger, it's interesting.
Pardon me?
I didn't remember this book having anything to do with Islam.
No, but
This was Muslim Muhammad.
the Mohammedan is the precursor to Islam.
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah,
So it is mentioned right here.
yeah, it is mentioned here. But it's mentioned in another place under the section of Melchizedek, also, if I remember correctly. So you want to look it up.
Yeah, because it says the greater Gautama, and that's referred to the Buddha,
Yeah, that's the Buddhist.
may
Yeah.
arise to lead all Indians to the search for the living God.
Yeah, that what they're talking about is because the Buddhists don't believe in a Godhead. They believe in this universal force, right? It's not really a concept of God the Father that we believe in, right?
Right, originally it was.
Originally it was, but it changed with which I forget which Buddha it was.
Hey, who's the controller, Roger, for all force? Is that the eternal isle of paradise? I know it's
Yes.
gravity, but
Yeah, yeah. Everything originates at the eternal isle of paradise. Yeah. Okay. Let's see. Did I change this?
you just read.
I just read it.
I just read that.
I think Millie's up.
All right, Millie.
Culture does not rest on a biologic foundation, but caste alone could not perpetuate the Aryan culture. For religion, true religion, is the indispensable source of that higher energy which drives men to establish a superior civilization based on human brotherhood.
There we go. That's what's to come, right? A superior civilization based on human brotherhood. I think we're going to stop there for tonight, and that'll give us 4 sections for next time. So strange. Tim, would you like to close us tonight in prayer?
Let's see. How about may the love, devotion, and bestowal of the majestic Son make available life everlasting with your endless mercy and love. May the God of the universe bestow upon us the full measure of His Spirit. Give us grace to yield to the leading of the Spirit by the loving ministry of devoted seraphic host. May the Son guide and lead us to the end of the age. Make us ever and increasingly like yourself, and at our end receive us into the eternal paradise embrace, even so in the name of the bestowed Son, and for the honor and glory of the Supreme Father. Not my will, but your will be done, Father.
Amen.
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 Thank you for joining us up on this Come See Us Next Week. Glad everything went smoothly tonight.
That was beautiful too.
Yes.
Thank you. I got it out of the blue book.
It's just beautiful.
It's good to hear those prayers.
Yeah.